Great to see so many faces. My name is Kirsty. I'm from Australian Progress. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners whose land we're all gathered on. I'm on Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Acknowledge that sovereignty over this land has never been ceded, and it is and always will be Aboriginal land. And to any First Nations folk on the call, I acknowledge your elders past and present as well. So my name is Kirsty. I'm the Executive Director at Australian Progress, and alongside Essential and Principal Co, the Guardian, Community Council for Australia and Australian Conservation Foundation, we host Australia at Home, a place where civil society can gather and hear what are the big issues going on in this moment of crisis. How is it affecting different communities? And really, listen, learn and cheer each other on. So welcome to the session today. If you're new to the session, I would recommend in the top right corner, clicking on those 9 little squares, that's gallery view, and that'll be a chance to see everyone's face. And recommend while you're here, if you can have your video on, gives us a sense of who's in the room. Down the bottom, you'll see the chat. Jess, our tech support person, has just written in the chat. And while we are getting started, it'd be great if you could just introduce yourself in the chat, say hello, and this will be the place we ask questions and add comments. Just letting everyone know that we are recording this session, and along with all the others, it'll be available afterwards. Would love to hear if you have a question. We'll invite you up later to share it. So put your comments in the space, introduce yourself, let us know what you're hoping to get out, and also add your questions. But now I'm really excited to hand over to Lizzie O'Shea from Maurice Blackburn. She's a human rights lawyer who will be hosting this session today on a very critical issue, gambling in the time of this crisis, and how we can work together to make sure the gambling industry does not come out stronger, and instead we can protect community and each other in this crisis. So I'll hand over to you now, Lizzie, to introduce our speakers and let us know how it's going to work.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to see so many people at this conversation. This is an issue that I first became interested in when I represented a small community organisation in Castlemaine in Victoria, who were trying to stop a poker machine venue being built in their town. And it became an issue for me that was intriguing because there's so much data we know about it. There's so many interesting ways in which this problem hides under the surface, but also in plain sight, that it's a huge source of harm, but we often don't talk about it. So I'm really excited to have this discussion today. We've got 2 really interesting people to have a chat about it and some others from the audience as well. So the first person who we're going to be speaking to is Margaret Quixley. She's the campaigns director for the Alliance for Gambling Reform. She joined the AGR after 10 years in the environmental sector as an advocate for BirdLife Australia and Places You Love campaign. And the other person we've got is Geoff Lemon, who's a writer, editor and broadcaster. He's the host of the cricket podcast, The Final Word, and the author of the book Steve Smith's Men Behind Australian Cricket's Fall. So let's perhaps start with Margaret. Margaret, can you talk to us a little bit about the scale and scope of gambling in Australia and why it's a conversation that perhaps takes on a renewed importance at this particular moment?
Thanks, Lizzie, and welcome everyone. I wanted to start the conversation today by just painting a little bit of a picture about gambling in Australia. As Lizzie pointed to, it is an issue that can be largely hidden and easily ignored, and that's often because the links between gambling and other health issues haven't firmly been established in public health, in public policy. So pre-COVID crisis, Australians were losing almost $25 billion a year on gambling, and that's the highest losses per capita in the world. And to just put that into perspective, our gambling losses are 40% higher than the next country, and that is Singapore. They're twice as high as the United States and 3 times as high as in the United Kingdom. So I just wanted to take a moment to consider why this is, because this isn't something that's inherent to Australians. The expansion of gambling in Australia is a deliberate policy choice. It is a government policy choice to allow advertising on our television screens to normalise gambling in the community and to allow poker machines into our suburbs. And just like all policy choices, they can be changed. The clearest example of this for me is in the state of WA, where we have the lowest losses per capita, and that's largely attributed to the fact that poker machines are confined to the casino. They don't exist in pubs and clubs like they do in other parts of Australia. Now, approximately later in the conversation, we're going to be talking about sports gambling, and we're also going to, but I just wanted to upfront talk about where the harm is most acute. About half of that 25 billion, so 12.5 billion, is lost in pubs and clubs around the country. And so they do by far the most harm, and they're in the suburbs, and they're certainly being normalised. Poker machines, we have more poker machines in the country than any other country in the world. So excluding a destination, gambling destinations like Macau and Monaco. We have nearly 200,000 poker machines in Australia. And so that's one for every 114 people, which is particularly shocking when you consider that this is concentrated on the eastern seaboard. And I also just wanted to give a shout out to a really great documentary that others, I think some of our colleagues can post in the chat now, that is Kaching Pokey Nation. And that will really highlight underscore the harm that is poker machines, and the fact that they are designed to addict using behavioural psychology through very sophisticated means. So we can't underestimate the nature of these machines. The other thing I really quickly wanted to touch on was the costs that often aren't spoken about, and that is the indirect costs of gambling harm. Now, the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation back in 2014 did a study which found that the costs of gambling into Victorians totaled 7 billion in that year. And while the direct financial losses of 1.3 billion made up part of that, some of the indirect loss, the cost that I wanted to point to was around the family and relationship breakdowns, the cost of mental ill health, to violence, the cost of loss of productivity. So this is a really wide scale intersecting issue. And it's fundamentally a social justice issue that drives inequality in Australia. And so that it needs to be considered through that context in terms of its relationships with other public health issues. The other point I wanted to make was that gambling doesn't just affect the person who is harmed by gambling. It affects research tells us, between 5 and 10 other people. So that is friends, family members, employers. So that is up to 5 million other Australians who are also impacted by gambling harm. And it's really important that we underscore the scale and magnitude of this issue, because I think it's not a world that we actually want to rush back to. We have an opportunity right now, and we're really excited by this opportunity at the Alliance, because it is an opportunity for us to reshape our relationship with gambling in this country. And that's why this conversation is particularly timely right now. We know that gambling harm is experienced deep and across the community. It's exacerbated by comorbidities like homelessness and mental ill health. And if we don't have a serious conversation about it now, it is something that will only continue to grow on the other side of this public health crisis. So we think it's a really important opportunity to engage in serious conversation, what kind of world and society we can build on the other side of this, and to shift the frame from clubs and pubs in particular, depending on gambling revenue in order to survive, to one where we can really enhance the already important role that they play in the community, and what kind of society we can rebuild on the other side of this. The other point I just wanted to touch on, because I know there's been a lot of media around the risks and the increase in online gambling since the crisis began, and that is true. We Australians are particularly vulnerable at this time. This is a highly stressful situation for all of us. We're all more vulnerable, but people experiencing gambling harm are even more vulnerable to the risks of online gambling. And we've already seen a shocking increase in gambling advertising, despite the absence of professional support. Of sport, and it's often framed as a way of killing boredom, and I guess this is why it's really worrying for us, particularly when we've got captive audiences in families and children who are undertaking distance education. So it's a particularly terrible time for industry to be allowed to exploit people, but today I really want to focus on the opportunity that is before us, and that is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reshape Australia's relationship with gambling harm in this country.
Yeah, so you talked about sport there quite a bit, Marg, and it's interesting to think about gambling as pretty much tightly bound up with sport in this country, which is a curious thing to imagine, given that there's almost no sport currently taking place. But sports and gambling didn't always go together so closely. Geoff, what is your experience as an observer of the various sporting codes in the country, and how gambling has changed that in recent memory?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because there's obviously a long relationship between sport and gambling, mostly with horse racing in Australia, that goes back 160 odd years. But what we've seen change in the last decade is the way that app technology and mobile phone technology has changed sports betting on every other conceivable sport, and beyond that on elections, on pretty much anything you can come up with to lay a wager on. It's been the ability to have punters as in the audience sense, sitting at home watching footy or watching cricket or whatever it is, and to be able to just hit their phone and open up a whole range of odds markets on every kind of niche sort of bet that you can find. And so there's enough in there to make people interested. Okay, of this partnership batting, who's going to be the one who gets out next? Who's going to kick the next goal in the footy? Who's going to be ahead at three-quarter time? All these kind of small things that maybe don't feel like so much of a commitment as betting on the outcome, but it plays on people's egos to think, well, I know this game, I know how it works, and I'm confident that I can predict how this is going to work out better than the markets can, or better than the sort of electronic faceless bookmaker can. So it's the thing that's really changed in the last decade has been just how tightly bound up together any sport has become with live in-play betting. And that's where a vast majority of the money that's wagered with online sports betting companies is betting in play, betting during the match itself, rather than betting on the outcome of the match. So the old idea of fixing games to, like, fixing the World Series in The Great Gatsby, fixing the result of the game to bet on it. The result of the game isn't really what's important anymore. It's the more exotic in-play niche bets. And because there are so many opportunities within a game, there are far more opportunities for people to bet. They're not just having a bet on the result. They could be having 50 bets on minor micro passages of play throughout a game. So that just multiplies exponentially the opportunities that sports betting companies have to get people to keep putting money down. And fundamentally, it's about forming habits. Any sort of gambling enterprise wants you to have the habit of betting and to keep going. It's not just making one bet once and then waiting for the outcome. It's doing it as an ongoing process. So if they can get people, as they have been able to, sitting on the couch at home or sitting in the pub, watching the game, and continually their way of engaging with the game is via betting, then that creates habit-forming behaviour in a much more lucrative way for the sports betting company than just having people bet on the outcomes.
If I can also just add, like, certainly the relationship in Australia is unprecedented in global terms, the closeness between the industry and the gambling industry and the sports industry. And I just wanted to also highlight, there's a number of ways that relationship works. So sports wagering codes, there's the really explicit ways in terms of sponsorship that we see around the boundary and in ads between games. But there's also the indirect product fees that sporting codes receive from the industry. That's on every bet placed on their code. And then there's the meta, which is the broadcast rights deals, which are inextricably linked with the value of the game, and they're negotiated based on the advertising space that can be sold. So I think it's really important that we drill down into the fact that as businesses become more exposed to the gambling industry, it is going to become harder and harder for sporting codes to separate themselves. But it doesn't mean that it's not possible. And we have examples recently in the FA in the UK dumping its major gambling sponsor. And here in Australia, obviously the clear one is with tobacco. But I think it really speaks to the point that we need to rethink fundamentally what role we want sport to play in Australia, and why sport exists and what values we're trying to teach, particularly our children. From our perspective, our focus really is around, when it comes to gambling advertising, the values that we're teaching children when gambling advertising is appearing on every second ad, and it's crafted through the narrative of odds. We've certainly heard a lot of players themselves speak out about the children coming to them speaking about the backing certain players and games based on the odds, and that's been really worrying for them, to the point that they're willing to take pay cuts. So I think it's a really important moment to be rethinking all of that relationship.
I did want to talk a little bit more about that, actually, because obviously a sport like the AFL is promoted as a family sport where children attend and participate. And to some degree also the AFL has cracked down on a couple of players. Geoff, did you want to talk a bit about this? When the AFL says that it doesn't support players gambling on the what kind of a message does that send to people who are watching it?
Well, this is one of the key incompatibilities in a lot of professional sport, which is that key to sport being respected as genuine is that it has to have integrity. It has to have, the contest has to have integrity. There can't be any ability to raise the conjecture that there might be passages of play that are fixed, or there might be outcomes that are prearranged. That as soon as you have that, a sport dies. You know, you can have no credibility if there's not a genuine contest. So sports, AFL, cricket, whatever major sport, they're all deeply concerned about that, which means that anything that has to do with players betting on the game or betting on any game is a massive exposure, a massive liability. Even if there's no real suggestion that would lead a player to try to influence the game that they're playing. There's an example from the 1981 Ashes when England were in a bad position in a test match and there were bookies giving them 500-1 odds to win. And so Dennis Lilly and Rod Marsh put a couple of pounds on at 500-1 because they thought it was funny. And then England came back and won the test match. And you know, no one's really going to think that Dennis Lilly lost the test match deliberately, but it just creates a bad, it's a bad visual, bad optics, as they say in PR. So because of those optics, because of that need to present the sport in a particular way, they have to be, the sporting administrators have to be completely no tolerance on players betting or being involved with betting. But at the same time, all of these codes are involved with promoting betting as the default way of engaging with the game, the most normal, harmless, fun, entertaining way of engaging with the game. All of the ads they're always a bunch of blokes having a great time at a pub or something. And it's marketing, it's selling you male companionship. This is how men can be friends and have a good time together, is through gambling. And so you've got these two completely contradictory ideas just pulling in opposite directions, that gambling is good, healthy, safe and normal, but also that any player found to be involved in the smallest bit of it is smacked immediately with bans, with censure, with fines, with all the rest of it, because this is a terrible thing they shouldn't be doing. So the two things are completely incompatible. They cannot go together, and yet they're being forced to coexist.
I did want to talk a little bit more about sport more generally, though, because it's not just the big professional sporting codes that do rely on gambling as a source of revenue to keep them afloat. Geoff, can you talk a little bit about how, say, community sport is also then dependent on revenue from, say, poker machines, which can seem like a totally separate form of gambling, but perhaps is then related to sport as well in its own way?
Yeah, and that, you know, that's a major part of it, is I guess the proliferation of things like leagues, clubs and RSLs and sporting clubs having those ties. And there are broader community outlets for that, but also a lot of the professional codes are involved with it as well. So probably just under half of the AFL clubs have poker machines in their club venues. Almost all of the rugby league clubs do, because that's a way that that's an alternative income stream, and it's worth huge amounts to some of them. You know, Hawthorn, Penrith, clubs like that have massive facilities. They have vast numbers of poker machines, and they make a lot of money out of it. And we're seeing a battle against it being played out in real time over the last few years, where one by one, at least in the AFL, a lot of clubs have decided that they don't like the optics again of being involved in that industry, and they've gradually worked out how to extricate themselves. You've got Cricket Australia sort of humming and hawing over it at the moment, but these professional clubs are more likely to be able to develop alternative revenue streams and to be able to succeed without it, whereas more community-based organisations are the ones who are going to struggle more. And so when you have campaigns against the density and proliferation of poker machines in the community, you'll also get the pushback from parts of the community saying this is how we do good work and this is how we keep the positive parts of our community operational and alive and running. So it's not necessarily an argument that stands up to a lot of examination, but the argument is there, and there do need to be other ways for community organisations to be able to fund themselves.
So what's that like, Marg? What's your experience of dealing with the argument that clubs need to have these poker machines as a source of revenue to fund social activities or other kinds of community sport and other community activities?
Yeah, well, to Geoff's point, when we did look at the books of, you know, a big AFL club moving away from dependency on poker machines versus a community club, there is a disparity between the dependency and the exposure of those clubs in terms of the revenue and source of income. And that's why we think it's a really important time right now to be having those kinds of conversations. Do we want social and community good to be funded by gambling harm? Like, this is the way that it's evolved, and it's been set up by design by governments, but this is the opportunity that's presented before us. You know, there is, of course, great work and an important role that clubs and pubs play in the community, but that doesn't have to involve gambling harm, and certainly those services don't need to be funded by gambling. So I think it's really about changing the discourse from being, look at the great work that we do, to what other ways can we fund and build safe community centres where people can gather and collect, but also fund the important work that happens without relying on the biggest, you know, on gambling harm and the biggest losses in the world.
The other thing that comes to mind, I suppose, with poker machines is that some of the biggest recipients of revenue are not actually clubs, even gambling companies, they're also governments. Mark, can you talk a bit about what the revenues are for some of the state governments from gambling on poker machines and other forms?
Yeah, so I think in Victoria it's at around 8%. I'm sure my colleagues can comment in the chat if that's incorrect, but from my recall, you know, like, I think it is, again, another opportunity, because with poker machines forcibly turned off in the community, it does, you know, smash those kind of conventional wisdoms and dependencies that have inhibited our ability to effectively have a discussion around harm and decouple the value that governments extract from the cost to society. I think that, you know, during this shutdown period, it is a fundamental reconsideration, and we've seen really great moves from the ACT government for leading by example, saying, look, we'll support the forfeiture of in effect, a poker machine buyback, to say these actually, you know, don't belong in our community clubs, don't belong in our society, and we'll support the rebuild, because we also want to ensure that, you know, people have jobs. And this is a really important part of the discussion, is that we have safe work for employees of these organisations, but we also know that for every $1 million that's expended in a hospitality, that creates 20 jobs versus 3 in just gambling. So this is the economics doesn't stack up either. I think when we're thinking about, particularly on the other side of this, stimulating the economy, reinvesting, we want to be reinvesting back in the community where we both do good, but where it makes economic sense, where we're actually creating jobs, sustainable, long term. I mean, you know, in New South Wales, the data came out a couple of weeks ago, $117,000 per machine that's lost in a pub in New South Wales. And think about if that money was spent in local bookshops and cafes, that's, you know, 0.3 of a person, a job funded for that poker machine. But how many other jobs in the community would that single machine in New South Wales fund? I think this is, you know, there was a really great, you know, the total losses from that same data, the total losses were found in clubs in New South Wales that could have funded the entire COVID package in New South Wales. So we had the package cost 3.3 billion, losses in clubs last year, 3.97 billion. So this is the kind of scale we're talking about. This is a fundamental reshift and it's a social justice and a social equity conversation that we need to be talking about, because it's not just the intergenerational debt that we're handing to the next generation, but also what kind of society we're handing and how we're setting up our economy to actually serve society and not just single gambling interests.
One of the key things with government is that gambling tax revenue it's safe tax revenue. Particularly conservative governments, they never want to be seen to be increasing taxes on anything, because that's an electoral exposure, that's a liability. But things where taxes are baked in, like cigarettes, alcohol, gambling, that's kind of free tax money. There's no electoral risk to bumping up the percentage, you know, a couple of points, the excise tax a couple of points, and increasing your take from there, while being able to do things with a public show benefit like income tax cuts and so on. You know, gambling revenue. So I used to work at Crown Casino when I was at uni. That was my uni job, was running roulette tables down there. And from memory, the pokies in the casino would be like, you have a thing on a gambling game called rate of return, which is how much of the money put through the game goes back to punters in terms of winnings, and the rate of return on most table games might be 97, 98.5%. The casino's keeping that 1 to 3%, and that still adds up to a huge amount of money. But on poker machines, it's about 90%. So they're keeping 10 cents out of each dollar. It's a huge take. And then that gets split between the pokie provider, the casino, and the government. So there's a vast amount of money, of sort of free, unproblematic in a way, money for governments. And the only thing that can make it problematic is people like Marg campaigning against it and making it uncomfortable that they're getting this income and why they're getting it and what the ramifications, what the consequences are for the communities that it's being extracted from.
Yeah, well, I think this is maybe a good time to see if we can find Luke in the audience, because has personal experience of gambling harm. And it's interesting that you talk about it as safe revenue, because I think politically that's true, in part because of the stigma attached to gambling addiction. I recall talking to specialist financial counsellors, for example, who worked in different places where people might be experiencing financial difficulties, and drug and alcohol rehab places, other kinds of health services. And the financial counsellor that experienced the most stigma for their clients, and they observed it, was in gambling, because people seem to think gambling is some kind of addiction that is not really justified as an addiction, that it's all about about willpower and self-responsibility. And I wonder if that's true. And I wonder if we could talk to Luke, if we can get him on unmuted. Luke, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
I would love to hear your perspective on that, that kind of narrative we see around gambling harm.
Yeah, I think it fits into actually a broader narrative we see around a lot of harms at the moment. I was thinking the other day how in this time of Corona, how we're talking about comorbidities for a disease like that, we perhaps need to be talking about social comorbidities. In other words, the people who tend to experience a lot of the harms in society, they tend to have a lot of different things that lead them down that path. It's not just that there's this one thing in their life. Maybe they've experienced a tragedy and they went to the poker machine room as a means of coping with that. Maybe they had depression or drug and alcohol abuse. So I think that talking more holistically about it is potentially a way to challenge some of that stigma, because what's certain for me is that any excuse to make it an issue of, well, this person's personal responsibility let them down, therefore we have no collective responsibility to help them, will ultimately lead to a minimizing of this issue. And I think that what you're saying makes a lot of sense, and in terms of gambling showing up in a lot of different ways due to that social stigma. So somebody might be willing to go down to a local charity and ask for help with the rent, but they may not say exactly why it is that they need help with the rent. And, when it comes to my lived experience, most of my gambling with the pokies happened as a young man. In fact, a lot of it before I was even 18 years old. And what that meant was that for me, gambling was all about being a winner, which certainly something that Geoff was saying really resonated with me. There's this way that young men gamble, which is, far from the image you might have of, an old lady sitting in a pokey room by herself. There is that sort of social element and that sort of performance piece in front of other men. That's a huge part of it. The only difference between the advertisements and reality is that a number of those men would be in severe distress and be ashamed of it and not being willing to talk about it. And so it's easy for those men to be painted as either non-existent or as the kind of loser that we don't need to be giving our compassion or collective action to.
Yeah, and that fundamentally, if you're gambling, there are winners and losers. There are people who've lost, and so we have that kind of social stigma around people who've lost. Well, you're a loser, therefore you don't deserve help. You don't deserve sympathy. You don't deserve to be included because you've already showed that you didn't win. You know, and we like to talk about Australia as a society that loves underdogs, but a lot of the time that's not really true. We love winners, and we don't really want to hear from those who've lost.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, what is particularly close to my heart is, you know, a lot of these issues around masculinity. You know, in the modern world, we're quite rightly wanting to talk a lot more about responsibility that men need to take for the harms of their behavior. But there's also that other piece, which is what are we doing as a collective to support the healthy development of young men? So this is an example of something that is not support or neutral. It's actually obstacles and problems that we're throwing in young men's lives that is going to show up in other areas. And, you know, I feel very fortunate in that I came from the kind of supportive environment that I could lose all my money but still have a safe place to go. But, you know, the kind of people who probably are going to be most harmed by this as far as that young men segment are going to be the younger men that have some of those social comorbidities. They're going to come from disadvantaged backgrounds. They're going to be dealing with mental health issues and things like that. So they're already marginalized. And what we're essentially doing is setting up traps to exploit them and take money off them, whilst at the same time, when they act out in the various ways that young men will act out, we'll say, okay, they need to be held accountable and responsible, and we'll come down very hard on them. So that's something that I personally feel very strongly about. And I think I feel grateful that I sort of missed out on sports gambling, in the sense that I had kind of worked through some of my gambling issues before the advent of the smartphone. I can only feel immense compassion for somebody who literally carries a casino or a bookie in their pocket wherever they go. I mean, it's why alcohol abuse is harder to get over than heroin abuse statistically. It's because avoiding alcohol is really hard. So how do you avoid gambling if it's literally in your pocket potentially 24/7? So, you know, those kinds of conversations where we think more holistically about not so much gambling, but the person behind the statistics and the numbers, and who are they, and where else are they showing up in services, in society, and how are they showing up, and what can we be doing to help them?
And we do have social constructs and political constructs that like to focus on the individual. They say everything's down to individual choice. If you've made mistakes, if you've fucked up your life, that's your problem. Those are your decisions.
Yeah.
No one made you do it. But at the same time, advertising wouldn't exist if it couldn't influence people's behavior. For any product, in any sector, advertising exists because it can change the way that people behave. So if you have advertisers that are set up to encourage people into destructive behavioural practices, then you can't then put all of the responsibility on individuals for being influenced by something designed to influence them.
So maybe this is time where we can now talk a little bit about what we could do instead, because we know that this is a source of revenue that is harmful. You know, the Victorian government, I think, takes somewhere near $1 billion every year from poker machines. Well, this is the first time those machines have really been turned off in living memory. And, you know, as you were saying before, Marg, a lot of this accepted wisdom around why we need them to keep our social fabric intact potentially start to fall away. What kind of reforms are potentially on the table to address this issue, to both address the problems with advertising that do influence people, especially at this vulnerable time when they're at home, but then also try to make sure that we don't return to normal with its deep problems associated with gambling?
Well, on the advertising front, I think this is a really important time to really actually just suspend gambling advertising permanently, like we have for tobacco and for other industries that we know are deeply harmful. Poker machines can't be advertised. There's a reason for that. and sports gambling similarly should not be widespread advertised, because we know that actually the recipients of those advertising messages, children are highly susceptible. They're already being influenced. It's already affecting. There's stacks of research to talk about that, 3 in 4 already think it's a normal part of sport, that 1 in 3 has already gambled. I could go on and on. We know that the impact, it's not just, an adult product being advertised to adults. It is children. Parents have no control over the advertising which their kids are exposed to. And it's just unacceptable. And the fact that we've seen an increase in advertising since the crisis started, and the exploitation in the absence of professional sport, we're seeing things like markets raised on weather, on Scott Morrison's tie. This is clearly just targeting people for targeting sake, and to, as Geoff said earlier, to keep them in the habit of gambling in the meantime before they can get professional sport back online. So to my mind, it is really about like banning those gambling ads. And on the front on the issue of poker machines, I think we have a fantastic opportunity to change the way we see the role, that really important role that clubs and pubs play in the community. When the shutdown measures are relaxed, we're going to need to have a place to come back together and to reconnect as a society. And do we want those places to be poker machine venues? Our answer is no. We know that poker machines drive social isolation. They're not the solution, but certainly the clubs and pubs play a really important role. And so what does that look like on the other side? How can we support these places to become thriving community centres, that bring back live entertainment and who's been hurt by the crisis as well, and comedians creating these opportunities for employment and safe employment, but also rebuilding a sector that isn't hinged on gambling harm and is incompatible with a really strong social fabric on the other side of this. So I think it is a really important opportunity. And we've just seen over the weekend, Steve Kinane published a really fantastic article, 3 incredibly powerful stories of how the venue shutdown is literally saving people's lives. Like, this is life and death for some people. And it can't be understated, the opportunity, and governments really do need to be taking it seriously. As I said, if they're going to be issuing and providing stimulus to different sectors, it needs to be with a mind to reducing gambling harm and rebuilding the type of society that we can all be proud of. So I think clubs and pubs play a really central role, but we need to be thinking, really scrutinising the role of poker machines within those venues.
From my perspective, looking at professional sporting codes, an absolute key thing is that every sport, if you look at how they present themselves to the public, they're always about kids. They're always about getting the attention of children, because that's how you get adherents who sign up for life to whatever footy team, or to follow the cricket, or whatever it may be. So they're explicitly positioning themselves as a product for children, as a way to get kids involved. They're always talking about how to get the sport to more kids, how to get more kids playing, how to get them loving it. And then at the same time, you can't be advertising things that are harmful to children if they're your explicitly stated intended audience. If they weren't, then maybe that rationale would stack up a bit more. So there was an interesting one earlier in the summer. There was a lot of pressure being put on Cricket Australia about their sports betting sponsorship partner. Tim Costello had come out and given them a big serve, saying that they were promoting damaging products to the community. Kevin Roberts, who's the boss of Cricket Australia, did an interview, and he said that, well, we don't promote gambling on the Big Bash, on the T20 competition, because that's a very family-focused, children-marketed event. It's all about getting kids involved. So therefore, that's okay. But they do still have all of the gambling placement on one-day internationals and test matches. The whole point of what cricket's about is trying to get kids to like those other forms of cricket as well. The Big Bash exists as a way to get kids into cricket, so that then they might graduate into other forms of cricket. And everybody who I know who loves cricket fell in love with it as a kid. They grew up watching test matches, one-day internationals. So it's a spurious distinction to say that this type of the sport is for kids and this type is not, because any type of the sport is, when you get kids into it, that's when you get them for life. And the same thing could apply to betting, to gambling on the sport. If you get them into those patterns of thinking as children, they're more likely to stay there for life. And I'm sure that's what the sports betting companies are wagering on.
So we are going to have time for some questions in a bit, and I see that some of you are putting them in already. But before we did, I just wanted to give a couple of minutes to Dave from the RSL, because there's a really interesting campaign underway there to reform how RSL clubs host poker machines and whether that's the appropriate choice for them. Dave, can I find you in the audience? Are you
Hi, Lizzie, I'm here. Yeah.
Hi, great. Dave, the floor is yours. Tell us about your campaign.
Sure. So RSL Victoria, unlike some other states, is the third largest operator of poker machines in Victoria. In other states, there is different ownership models and branding responsibilities. But in Victoria, we have Crown Casino, the Woolworths sort of ALH group, and then we have the RSL. The RSL is a charity that is designed to support veterans and their families, you know, suffering from the effects of their service to the nation. Yet we have an organisation that runs, you know, thousands of poker machines across the country, across the state, and RSL Victoria is in a really, really poor financial position, and coronavirus has just made that even more serious of a situation. They're estimated to be running at a $7-odd million deficit this year, and prior to coronavirus, we're already running at a $3 million deficit. These machines are not generating the income required, even if you accept the moral and ethical challenges of taking money from poker machines and the community to pay for veteran welfare. The fact is that these machines are not doing that, and we have the evidence to that. And so as a result, we're looking to bring reform within the RSL to seek ethical and socially responsible avenues of fundraising, so that we can go and do our charitable work without preying on other members of the community. And so this year we have an election for the state board, and so we're looking to place sort of those with fresh ideas onto the state board.
So you're a vet yourself, Dave, obviously. Do you think there's a particular vulnerability amongst vets for gambling addiction, or have you seen that?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm a veteran. I served in Afghanistan. We know of many veterans who, you know, Luke talking earlier about young male victims of gambling harm. We have an entire cohort of young male victims who are just ready for the taking. And whilst the opposition to gambling or poker machines may or may not be present, the reality is that we do have a very core group of individuals that we're trying to help that are also the same people who are vulnerable to harm. And we know of stories of individuals who have gone into an RSL to get support to get claims against the government for the harm caused from their service to the nation, and who have spent that entire payout given to them by the Department of Veterans Affairs in that very same RSL sub-branch that operates poker machines. And we're not talking small amounts of money. We're talking, you know, we know of one individual who put $360,000, his entire payout for losing both of his legs, one of his arms and half of his stomach from an IED blast, put all that money through the same RSL sub-branch that assisted him to get that payout. And we just think that that is morally, you know, bankrupt as an organisation. And you know, we've got 250 sub-branches all across Victoria. We wish we ran the biggest wellness centres network in Victoria. We had a gym, we had psychologists, psychiatrists, GPs, allied health professionals, where members of the community could pay a subscription to be members of that and prioritise veterans through that process. So there's lots of alternative income streams. Our organisation has just invested billions of dollars, and the community has pumped billions and billions of dollars into our organisation, thinking that they're assisting veterans when there is absolutely no link to show that happens.
Thanks so much for that, Dave. I might just start opening it up to a few. Oh, sorry, take it away.
No, that's all right. Yeah, Dave, I just wanted to ask you, like, from what I've read, one of the hardest things, and from friends I've known, one of the hardest things about being a vet is after you've served, having sort of losing that sense of camaraderie, that sense of, you know, knowing exactly your place, having a group of people around you who understand what you're going through every day, and then sort of returning to broader society. It's like there are all these people around who don't actually understand what your life has involved, what you've been through. And so is something like an RSL a refuge, a place to go where you feel like maybe people do understand more. And then that's a particular side of vulnerability, because there is that ability to gamble once you go to one of the few places where you might actually feel at home.
Yes, I do think that that is true, but I don't believe the venue that you're talking about looks like what we think of an RSL with pokies, palmies and pints. So, you know, Anzac Day this year, I had a dawn service out in my driveway, had a young man walk past who lives 5 doors up the road. He realized that I had my medals on, and he came back and said, I didn't know that you lived just down the road. And we spoke for 3.5 hours over a drink, and we had a chat, and, you know, he's having some real mental health challenges, and we were able to talk about it. So that seeking camaraderie is absolutely there. But if you go to a venue that is open to the public, that has loud flashing signs, loud noises from the machines, alcohol, not a really healthy diet, that is not providing the avenue that veterans are seeking. And I'm certainly sort of involved in an RSL that has sort of exponential growth, because it's that camaraderie that you're talking about, but without the detraction and negative aspects of the machines.
Trying to make it actually a safe place to go to seek that camaraderie.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, there have been questions coming through. If you have got questions you'd like to ask, you're welcome to pop them into the chat. I've got already a few more than I need, but I'm always happy to take more. Let's maybe start, if we can find Russell Johnston to ask his question. If we can't find him, I'm happy to read it out myself. Unless he interrupts me, I'm going to read it myself.
Probably wise. I forgot what I was going to say.
Okay, Russell, I'll do it for you. No worries. He said hotels that rely on poker machine revenue are likely to go bankrupt and unlikely to open again. What will happen to these poker machines, do you guys think? Will there be compensation associated for the companies or the venues?
I can speak to that. I think that, I mean, we need to, we're not supportive, certainly. It's not possible for the governments to buy back 200,000 poker machines, and we don't think that it should be framed in this way. It's an entitlement. It's not something, it's not a property right. But I think that, you know, we do need to be thinking holistically, as like Luke really beautifully pointed to, about the workers of these venues and the role that these venues play in the community, and how we can actually support them come back better, you know, build back better. It's not, you know, and we're talking about free from gambling harm. So if there is stimulus injected into these venues, that those stimulus is tied, as it was in the ACT, to taking pokies out. And so we would like to see them permanently extinguished. If they're removed, they shouldn't be resold to another venue. They should be taken out from the community and permanently removed.
Okay, Judy Avasar, I've got you having asked a question as well. I'm going to start to ask it myself unless you interrupt me, which is that you signed the latest petition that Marg put out at the AGR, the Alliance for Gambling Reform, and you wanted some advice about how to convince your local MP. So if anyone in the Zoom today is interested in talking to their local MP, what advice might any of our speakers, but maybe we can start with you, Marg, might you have for speaking to MPs in compelling ways about this topic?
Thanks for the question, Judy. I can see you in the chat, and good to see you again. Thank you for the question. I think our team, and a number of them are on the call today, so they'll be listening in as well. They're putting together the resources now that you'll need to speak to your state politicians. So we need that there's different decision makers. Obviously, when it comes to poker machines, we are focused on at the state level, and we've already got some resources online right now where people can start to engage their state member. And from our perspective, it's really important that the conversation is framed about the opportunity before us, that the opportunity is for the community to come together and to build back better, and for us to actually reimagine the role of clubs and pubs in our community, particularly a role that is creating a thriving club sector and being a place that is safe for everyone to come back to on the other side of this. So we certainly will have some more targeted resources. We do already have a template online that you can send to your local state MP, and people have already forwarded us initial responses, some really positive responses from their state members saying this is an issue that they want to hear about and want to talk about. So I think that really it's about you know, volume, and then more people that are engaging their state MPs, and the more we're talking about it in the media, the more impetus there will be, as you say, for governments to really be reconceptualizing at this time.
Thank you.
Great. I've got another question from Sharon Taylor. Sharon, can we find you in the Zoom and unmute you?
Right. Yep, here I am.
Yeah. Great.
I do mental health advocacy, so I'm not a lot don't know a lot about gambling, but it does remind me of stigma and judgment, you know, and I guess in all mental health, counsellor, you want real non-judgmental attitude. So I think that it seems like there's still a lot of judgment about gambling, and that if we could reframe that to get more empathy, you know, and reframe the needs, I guess, that it's fulfilling, and sort of reframe that. But it does seem like more compassion and empathy, but understanding, I guess I need education about the drivers and the person, like it has been covered, the person behind it. And I really, and the mental health, I think there was a really key thing. I love that about the individual, the focus on the individual. And, you know, even with depression, it was for 17 years, I was the problem. And then I realized it was the environment, it was external factors. So I think it's the same sort of thing, anyway, but I do hope that Australians can help be more empathetic to people who have this gambling addiction and understand it like other addictions.
I think a huge part of it is that we, as human beings, we don't like to see other people suffering a bad fate that we're afraid of happening to ourselves. So we see someone with who's lost a lot of money, we have a horror of that. If we see someone who's addicted to drugs, we have a horror of that. It's the reason why people look down on other people with disabilities, that sort of thing, because there's a fear of, you know, what if this happened to me, and then that makes people hate or direct anger towards the person who's making them afraid of that thing, in a feedback loop that's really unfair.
I was going to just also add that it actually starts with people like Luke speaking out and actually putting their name and their face to this issue. And you know, reducing stigma is always about talking, and that's part of our role as an organisation as well, is about elevating the voices of people that are most impacted and saying that this could happen to anyone. This is a societal issue. This is something we're all responsible for. It's not just, you know, in the periphery, in the corners. It's something that, you know, as I mentioned earlier, it impacts, you know, the circle around the people as well. So I don't know, Luke, if you want to point to it, I know you're really passionate about mental ill health too. And certainly our campaigners, Sharon, are really engaged, particularly reaching out to other organisations working on the issues that we know intersect with gambling harm, because I think even in our sector, there's more education and more, we need to strengthen those links as well, to make sure that we're presenting that public face to governments and that holistic solution as a civil society as well.
Yeah, no, I wanted to add something to that, and you captured that issue pretty well, Marg, because I think that, you know, I've spent my whole career in the not-for-profit sector, and one of the challenges is that competitive aspect, which at times feels inevitable, in the sense that there's competition for space in the media landscape, there's competition for access to politicians, there's always this sense of trying to get your issue into the limelight. And, you know, whilst that's understandable, I'm hoping that of some opportunities the coronavirus provides us is an opportunity to really put that collective community network approach front and center. Because maybe it is a guy whose partner showed up at a DV clinic, shelter, who needs help with gambling. Maybe it's somebody who showed up asking for financial help. And it's by thinking holistically and building a sort of you know, there's a difference between genuine collective action and self-interested cooperation. You know, self-interested cooperation might be when Cricket Australia goes, now it's in our business interest to do something different on gambling. But that's not actually thinking as a community and collectively. So we have this opportunity to do that. And with this issue in particular, because I know in New South Wales, where I'm from, we always talk about the challenge of politicians being, you go and show us the evidence of gambling harm and essentially prove that it's a problem. But yet we all know it's a problem, but finding that siloed A plus B equals C solution for the politicians is not necessarily always possible. So maybe it is about being more collective in how we think about this. And I really, you know, with the issue, I care about young men, but then there's lots of other segments in the population who could only benefit from that.
Yeah, so we've got Marty Thompson, who might be able to make his way to the front, so to speak, who talked about Johann Hari and others describing addiction as the opposite of connection, which I think is an interesting observation. I'm not sure if you're around, Marty. Feel free to
hi
jump in.
guys. Yeah, that's just a line that I've heard being pushed a lot lately that I have some sympathy with. I mean, if we accept that I mean, I know this is a multi-layered, multi-issued sort of concept, problem gambling, but if you take this idea of the opposite of addiction as connection, what does our national obsession with gambling say about the soul of us, and what does it say about the quality of connections that we have in our communities? Has the panel got some thoughts on that kind of stuff?
The first thing that I would say, thanks for your question, Marty, is I guess a common misconception is that the most gambling harm is experienced by the kind of most, like the people at the top of the percentile, the people who put the most money into the machines, or the most heavily impacted. But in fact, harm is concentrated, if we think about it as a bell curve, in the low to moderate risk gamblers, essentially. So I think we just need to be really cautious by framing the problem as being only addiction, because we know that there's a scale, and certainly harm is experienced across that scale and across all sectors of society. And so when we're addressing the problem, I guess it's easy, and in fact, you know, it's a frame that governments, through the individualist lens, and industry themselves have used to kind of frame this gamble responsibly, drink responsibly narrative. It's the problem of the individual top, you know, the 3 or 4% at the edges, but it's actually not the case. The majority of people that impacted the most harm are in the middle. So that should inform our public health response. In terms of what it says about our society, I mean, I don't know, this is an open conversation. I'll be led by others on the call as well, but I think it's something that we need to be reevaluating, and this is a really great time to be doing it. How do we want social services to be funded? How do we want them to be connected to one another? How do we want to treat people as holistic humans when we're addressing, as I say, that it's never one issue. It's often touching multiple. I don't know, Dave or Luke, did you have a comment?
Well, I know with myself, without getting too intellectual, just speaking from lived experience, it definitely had a lot to do with hidden mental health issues that took literally 10 years after my gambling issues for me to address. And I think that thinking of it as far as if somebody has 5 things that are really causing them trouble in their life, and then they commit suicide, each one of those 5 things in isolation may not have been enough to trigger the red flags that would get them help. And they'd be just one of millions of people who sit around feeling lonely or feeling unfulfilled in their life. So I don't think that there's an answer I can give to that, only to say that to ask that question critically and push back on ScoMo's like, how good's Australia kind of, you know, sloganism, I think is really, really important, because there's a lot of things that we could do better here. So, yeah.
Great. I think we're pretty much out of time. I wanted to thank Dave and Luke particularly for sharing their stories, Geoff and Marg for providing some wonderful insights. I think we can all agree that this is a problem that is solvable, that perhaps that solution is within our grasp right now more so than ever. So I wanted to thank the Australia Institute and the other partners today for supporting this discussion, because I think it's a wonderful one to have. I might throw to Kirsty now to wrap us up and give us some final details before we close out.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Lizzie. And thank you, Luke and Dave and Geoff and Margaret for sharing all of your experience and intellect on this issue. It's a really critical one, and I think it's been a very engaged discussion, and I'm loving all the connections that are being formed on the conversation. We'll send everyone an email afterwards with some of the key links that have been shared in this chat today, and there'll be opportunities to as well send in your feedback. We'd love to hear your feedback. We're running these sessions every weekday, 1 till 2 p.m. So tomorrow you can tune in for the Political Geek Fest with Peter Lewis and Catherine Murphy, hearing about the Essential report that's going on, hearing about where the community's at, On Wednesday, we're learning about Untrumping America from Dan Pfeiffer from Pod Save America, so I can recommend that. And later in the week, we're looking at the COVID app and whether we should be trusting this app or not. So there's some really critical discussions happening this week, so I recommend tuning in. And like we said at the start, we're recording this, so you can go on the Australia at Home website and find this one again, but also all of the other past recordings as well. I'd like to say thanks to all the partners again, Essential, the Community Council Australia, Principal Co, and I'm from Australian Progress, and we're backed by Australian Conservation Foundation and others. So thank you so much everyone for tuning in today. Really appreciate the conversation that's been had by our speakers, and look forward to seeing you all on the different petitions and campaign opportunities that have been shared today, and hopefully some of those connections that have been formed will keep us going so we can use this opportunity to get rid of the gambling industry and its stronghold over sport and pokies. So thanks everyone, and thanks so much Lizzie for hosting. See you everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.